Hi! So on today's video I will show you how I made this solid wood cabinet, and this is actually the first bigger piece of furniture that I've built. So let's see how that went. I chose to build the cabinet out of some birch, as it is quite a lot cheaper here in Finland compared to other woods like maple or oak. As I said, this was my first bigger piece of furniture, so I thought if I mess something up, at least the cost wouldn't be that high. Like with most woodworking projects, I started by milling down the lumber, by running it through the jointer. First I tried the full boards that were 3 meters or 10 feet long, and after the first pass I realized that maybe I should chop them up to smaller pieces before jointing. I had a really rough sketch of the build, so I had an idea on what length pieces I would need, so I started cutting the boards down to rough length with my circular saw. Once I had all the needed pieces, it was time to go back to the jointer, and I start jotting down the boards. You can also see the before mentioned sketch or plans for the build. And after the jointer, it was time to turn the jointer into a planer and start planing down the boards. Once all the boards were even thickness, I moved to the table saw and ripped all the boards so they had even width as well. Then it was time to do the first glue up, and I say first because I do not have enough clamps to glue up all the panels on one go, so I had to do them in steps. It is also good to have a habit of looking at the grain direction when making glue ups, but also checking how the surface looks and if there are any knots or defects you want to avoid in the panels. I was able to put in 3 panels into one glue up, but I had to remember not to put glue between all the boards as I needed to have 3 separate panels at the end. Then on the next morning the first set of panels was done, and it was time to repeat what I just had done on the previous evening and set up the next panels. After the second set of panels was done, I was able to move on to the next step, and that was cutting the panels to the right width to set how deep the cabinet would be. This cabinet will be in our entryway, so we didn't want it to take too much space, as the main purpose is to get a surface there where we can lay down keys and other things when we come home, with the additional bonus of having some storage space as well. So we ended up having the cabinet to be 25 centimeters deep, which is just under 10 inches. There was also the second reason for not making the cabinet too deep, and that was that my planer can only run boards that are, surprise surprise, 25 centimeters wide. After having planed all the panels, I started marking them, so I would know which panel would make each piece of the cabinet, so it would be easier for me to cut them to the correct size. And then it was time to go to the table saw and start cutting them down. To make sure that the mirroring panels were the same size, I cut them at the same time. I will be adding a backer panel from plywood to the cabinet, and for that I needed to cut a groove for it to sit in. I also used a scrap piece of wood to get the right size for the groove. I think you could also do this by cutting a rabbet to the back of the panels, but I think it has a nicer look when it's done this way. Not that many would be looking behind the cabinet, as it will be next to a wall, but anyways. After cutting the grooves, I realized that I had made a bit of a mistake, because I won't be making a miter joints between the sides and the top and the bottom panels. As I cut the grooves for full length of the panel, the groove is now visible from the end of the top and bottom. So this is something we need to fix on later on. To avoid this, I could have made the grooves with a router. Now that I had the outer shell of the cabinet done, it was time to cut the middle dividers to size. I will have an open shelf at the top of the cabinet and then 4 box-shaped shelves behind 2 doors at the bottom section. And now that all the pieces were cut, I could start to see the shape of the whole thing. As I will be attaching the back panel to the groove, I still needed to cut the internal dividers so that they would not be in the way of the back panel. While I'm doing that, I think this is a good spot to remind you that if you have made it this far into the video, please consider leaving it a like and subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this. Then, as I had all the pieces cut and ready, it was time to find a way to connect them to each other. And for this build I chose to go with dowels. I thought about cutting dados, but ended up going with dowels. Dominoes would have been a great easy option as well, but unfortunately Festool has not sent me one yet. So if you could please hit that subscribe button so I could hopefully get one eventually. Once I had all the end grain holes drilled, it was time to make the counterparts for them. And to make the holes for the dowels, I used the doweling jig and it made the alignment much easier. Even though I have now mentioned the back panel a couple of times, I had not yet cut it. But now was the time to do so, and to make the cuts I used Greg's AccuCut jig with my circular saw. Now, having all the pieces ready, it was time to do the dry assembly, just to see if everything would go together as I had hoped. And, as you can maybe see, there is a small piece running below the top panel, and that is so that we can attach the cabinet to a wall with screws, as it is quite shallow but tall and the doors will be solid wood as well, and therefore quite heavy. So to avoid it from falling down, we will be hooking it up to a wall. As I had now made sure that everything goes up together as planned, it was time to start sanding down the panels, as it will be way easier to do it now rather than after the assembly. And again, due to the lack of clamps, I will be actually splitting the assembly into stages. First assembling the insides and the sides of the cabinet, and after that attaching the back panel, top and bottom. After the first glue up had dried overnight, it was time to sand over the squeeze out glue and then move on to the next part of the glue up as I just explained. Do you still remember the grooves that were showing up at the ends of the top and bottom panels? Now it was time to fix that. So I had a scrap piece from the panels from which I could cut down correct size plugs with the pull saw to plug the holes from the panels. With some glue and few taps with a mallet, the issue was resolved. I've now said that I had all the pieces ready, and that hasn't been exactly true, as I'm still actually missing 3 more pieces, which are 2 doors and then the base for the cabinet. But let's start with the doors. Here the limitations of my planer came in a form of hand planing, as I could not fit the doors through the planer even if I had cut them down into each individual door. Once I had hand planed enough, it was time to start cutting the doors out of this panel. The first cut I made with the circular saw, as I wasn't able to fit this onto the table saw, and I clamped a level to act as a guide. After that, I was able to move to the table saw and cut both of the doors to right size. And by cutting the doors from one panel, they have a look that they are from one panel and wood grain continues between them. Next, it was time to start attaching some hardware to the doors, as they needed hinges to operate. I am using these Euro-style concealed hinges with a soft close. And to make the holes for them, I used Greg's concealed hinge jig, which made the job quite easy. To attach the other side of the hinges to the cabinet, I laid it down on its side and then had the door next to it. I made sure with a combi square that it was the right distance from the bottom of the cabinet and then marked down the center line of the holes onto the cabinet. The hinges came with instructions, and on that it says that the holes on the cabinet's end should be 37mm from the edge of the cabinet. So I used the combi square again to mark another line on top of the lines that I just made to mark down where to drill. Then it was just a matter of drilling the holes and attaching the hinge part to the frame, and then just attaching the doors to the frame and enjoying the soft close action. Or not, as it looks that I needed to do some adjusting on the hinges to not have the doors overlap. But now, having the doors almost completed, it was time to move on to the base for the cabinet. I made one template beforehand, which I then used to trace the shape to other cutoffs from the build, and then just cut them out with a jigsaw. After having all the pieces, I used the sandpaper to make sure that they were exactly the same. Easier way to do this would be doing it by a router with a flustering bit, but I didn't have long enough bit to do that, so I went this way. Then, from other cutoffs from the panels, I got the aprons for the base. I attached the pieces again by using dowels to add some strength to the joints. Once the first glue-ups were dry, it was then time to attach the middle dividers for the base between the two pieces. After the glue-ups were done, I also added a round over to the base to get a smoother look to it and to break the hard corners of the rest of the cabinet a bit. To attach the base to the frame, I will be just using screws. I drilled 6 holes through the base with a smaller bit and then used a thicker bit to drill onto the smaller holes to have a screw heads getting hidden in there and not to have to use so long screws to attach the base. After having the holes drilled, it was just a matter of centering the base onto the frame and then screwing it in. As some of you might have already thought, am I not going to attach any pulls to the doors? Well, yes I am, I just forgot to do it earlier. And not to fool you by editing magic, I will show you now how I did it. Again, from a scrap piece of wood, I made a template and then drilled the holes to the doors and attached the pulls to both of the doors. And now we get to enjoy the soft close action. The gap between the doors isn't perfect yet, but I will take care of that once I have put the finish onto the piece. Speaking of the finish, now I needed to break down the edges with hand sanding and also water up the whole thing before I could add the finish on it. For the finish, I chose Rubiomonocoat in the color of sky grey. We were juggling between this and the mud light, but chose this at the end. This was my first time using Rubio, and in hindsight, I should have cut the pad down to smaller pieces to make applying easier, or to use a plastic card to wipe it on the whole piece before wiping it down with a pad or a cloth. But you live and learn. Once the piece had had a couple of days to dry up, it was time to assemble it back up and to carry it inside on its final spot. Overall, this was a nice project to do, much more difficult than the small projects that I've done this far. I learned a lot, but I also think I am more comfortable on taking on the other bigger projects that I have waiting for me. This project was also my take on the Rockler Try That Challenge, which Rockler is doing together with Chris from 4 Eyes Furniture and Sean from Sean Boat made this. I would also like to hear what has been your first bigger build that you've done, or if you haven't done that yet, what are you planning to do? And if you made it this far, thank you for watching and I'll see you on the next one.